The Orion princess gasped in agony, sapphire blood gushing from the gaping wound in her abdomen, as the human doctor frantically worked to save her life, while 1,000 Orion warships loomed menacingly above Earth. "Listen up, you whippersnappers," grizzled Dr. Chris Kennedy growled to the wide-eyed medical students in the dimly lit lecture hall. "I'm about to tell you the story of how one human doctor changed the course of galactic history, averting humanity's annihilation." The students leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Kennedy took a deep breath, his voice low and intense. "It all started when the Orions made first contact. They were a proud warrior race centuries ahead of us technologically, but they were not prepared for the horrors lurking in space's depths. The Orions encountered a new alien species, parasites their advanced weapons couldn't defeat. The parasites infected their crews, twisting them into mindless, violent drones. In desperation, Orion High Command broadcast a distress signal across the galaxy, pleading for aid. But no one answered their call. His eyes narrowed. No one except a single human doctor fresh out of med school, eager to prove himself, me. Kennedy's fists clenched as he relived the memory. The Orion princess, infected by the mind-controlling parasite, was humanity's only hope. If I couldn't remove the creature from her brain, the Orions would purge Earth to stop the parasite's spread. Billions would die. The fate of our world rested in my inexperienced hands. He looked each student in the eye, his gaze unflinching. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour, and how one man's skill and determination saved us from extinction. Strap in, kids. You're about to learn the true meaning of humanity, fuck yeah. I know you're wondering why I, a wet-behind-the-ears doctor, would volunteer for such a dangerous mission. Well, let me tell you, I had something to prove. I wanted to show the world that I had what it took to make a difference, to save lives no matter the odds. His eyes flashed with determination as he continued, "So I gathered a team of the bravest, most skilled volunteers I could find. We loaded up our research vessel with medical supplies and set out for the Orion ship, not knowing what we'd find." The scene shifted, and the students found themselves on the Orion battleship, following Chris and his team as they cautiously made their way through the deserted corridors. The once bustling ship was now a tomb, the only sound the echoing of their footsteps. We finally reached the bridge, and what we found there was straight out of a horror movie. The few survivors, including Princess Primus herself, were barricaded inside, barely clinging to life. They were scared out of their minds, and rightfully so. Chris's voice softened as he described the Orion princess. Princess Primus was a sight to behold, even in her weakened state. She had been sent to oversee the ship's mission, a testament to her bravery and leadership. But now she was just as terrified as the rest of her crew. He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. The princess told us about the parasite, how it had infected most of the crew and turned them into mindless drones. The survivors had managed to seal off the bridge, but they were running out of supplies and hope. They had sent out the distress call as a last resort, never expecting anyone to answer. Chris looked each student in the eye, his gaze intense. But there I was, a human doctor ready to help. I knew that if we couldn't find a way to stop the parasite, it would be the end of not just the Orions, but potentially all life in the galaxy. Chris takes a sip of water, letting the silence linger for a moment before he resumes his tale. We knew time was of the essence. The parasite was spreading like wildfire through the ship, and it wouldn't be long before it breached the bridge. I ordered my team to set up a makeshift lab in an abandoned cargo bay, while Princess Primus and I put our heads together to gather intel on this alien menace. His eyes sparkle with admiration as he speaks of the Orion princess. Primus wasn't just a pretty face. She was a brilliant scientist, and together we combed through the ship's medical records and sensor data, looking for anything that might give us an edge. The students lean forward, hanging on his every word, as Chris's voice rises with excitement. And then Primus found it, a pattern in the parasite's genetic structure, a chink in its armor that we could exploit. But to do that, we needed a sample of the creature itself, and that meant going into the belly of the beast. The scene dissolves, and the students find themselves following Chris and Primus as they venture into the heart of the infestation. They're clad head to toe in protective gear, but even that can't shield them from the horror that surrounds them. The walls pulse with a sickly alien biomass, and the air is thick with the stench of decay. We found one of the drones, its body warped and twisted by the parasite. Primus held it down while I took the sample, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the syringe. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever done, but we got what we needed and hauled ass back to the lab. Chris blinks away tears as he recalls Princess Primus's bravery. I watched her walk out of the lab, her head held high, knowing she might not return. It was the longest hour of my life, waiting for her signal that the reactor modifications were complete. He clenches his fists, the memory still raw. When she finally radioed in, her voice was strained, exhausted. She'd had to fight her way through hordes of drones, but she'd done it. The reactor was ready. Chris leans forward, his eyes blazing with intensity. I input the frequency, my fingers trembling over the console. This was it. Our one shot. If it didn't work... He shakes his head, banishing the thought. But it did. The pulse ripped through the ship, and on the monitors we watched as the drones collapsed, the parasite withering and dying inside them. It was over. The students are on the edge of their seats, breathless. What happened to Princess Primus? One of them asks, her voice barely a whisper. Chris's face darkens, a shadow passing over his features. She didn't make it back to the bridge. The parasite had infected her during her mission, but she'd hidden it, determined to complete her task. When the pulse hit, He trails off, unable to continue. The room is silent, the weight of Princess Primus's sacrifice hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Chris speaks again, his voice rough with emotion. She gave her life to save her crew, to save Earth. Without her, none of us would be here today. The scene shifts, and the students find themselves on the engineering deck, the reactor's sickly blue glow casting twisted shadows on the walls. Princess Primus stands before the infected core, her face a mask of revulsion and resolve. She didn't hesitate, Chris continues, his voice thick with emotion. She plunged her hands into that pulsating mass of flesh and machine, tearing through it like a wild animal. The biomass fought back, tendrils coiling around her arms, but she ripped free, claws dripping with ichor as she input the final command. The students gasp as a monstrous drone erupts from the reactor, a grotesque fusion of Orion and machine. Its razor limbs slice through Princess Primus's armor, sapphire blood spraying across the deck. But the princess holds her ground, parrying the drone's blows with savage grace. It was a dance of death, Chris whispers, his eyes distant. Claws against steel, fury against desperation. Princess Primus fought like a woman possessed, matching the drone's inhuman strength with sheer, indomitable will. But even a warrior princess has her limits. The drone lands a devastating blow, sending Primus crashing into the reactor controls. Sparks fly, alarms blare, and the containment field flickers dangerously. She knew she couldn't win, Chris says softly, his voice breaking. So she made the ultimate sacrifice. With her last ounce of strength, Princess Primus engaged the emergency lockdown, sealing herself inside with the drone, buying me the precious seconds I needed to activate the pulse. The students are frozen, barely breathing as they watch the scene unfold. Through the security feed they see Princess Primus and the drone locked in a fatal embrace, the reactor's eerie light flickering over their entwined forms. Chris's hand hovers over the pulse activation switch, his face a mask of anguish. I hesitated. God help me, I hesitated. But then I heard her voice over the comm, fierce and unwavering. Do it, Chris. Save them all. Chris slammed his fist on the console, tears streaming down his face as he watched Princess Primus's life force ebbing away on the reactor room floor. The students in the lecture hall held their breath, captivated by the raw emotion in his voice. I couldn't do it, Chris choked out, his eyes haunted by the memory. I couldn't activate the pulse, not while she was still in there, still fighting. On the screen behind him, Grainy security footage played out the desperate struggle. Princess Primus, her once pristine armor now shattered and stained with her own sapphire blood, grappled with the monstrous drone. The two figures were a tangle of razor-sharp claws and thrashing limbs, the drone's inhuman shrieks echoing through the reactor room. "Just when I thought all hope was lost, Primus did the impossible," Chris whispered, his voice filled with awe. With a burst of strength that could only come from the depths of desperation, she wrenched herself free from the drone's grasp. The students gasped as they watched Primus, her face contorted in a mask of primal rage, plunge her hand into the drone's chest. Her claws punctured the grotesque, pulsating mass that passed for the creature's heart, and with a sickening squelch, she ripped it free. The drone convulsed, its unearthly shrieks rising to a crescendo before it collapsed, its body dissolving into a puddle of foul-smelling ichor. But Primus had not emerged unscathed. A jagged gash ran the length of her torso, her lifeblood pouring out onto the reactor room floor. "She was dying," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. But even in her final moments, Primus's only thought was of her duty, of the mission. On the screen, Primus dragged herself to the reactor control panel, leaving a trail of sapphire blood in her wake. With trembling fingers, she input the final sequence, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, in a moment that would be forever etched into Chris's memory, Primus turned to face the security camera. Her eyes, once fierce with the fire of an Orion warrior, were now dimmed by pain and the shadow of impending death. But there was something else there, too. A quiet resolve, a steely determination to see her mission through to the end. She nodded once, a silent signal that she was ready for Chris to activate the pulse. Chris's finger trembled as it hovered over the pulse activation button. Princess Primus's final nod seared into his memory. Tears blurred his vision, but he blinked them away. There was no time for hesitation. With a ragged breath, he slammed his hand down on the console. The ship shuddered violently as the electromagnetic pulse tore through its systems. Sparks erupted from overloaded consoles, bathing the bridge in a hellish strobe of light and shadow. On the flickering security monitors, Chris watched in horrified fascination as the parasite biomass withered and crumbled, its unearthly screams echoing through the speakers. One by one, the drones collapsed, their twisted bodies hitting the deck with sickening thuds. It was like watching a macabre puppet show, their strings cut by an unseen hand. In mere moments, the once terrifying creatures were reduced to lifeless husks, their threat extinguished in a blaze of electromagnetic fury. "We did it," Chris whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "It's over." But even as the words left his lips, a cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach. The image of Princess Primus, broken and bleeding on the reactor room floor, flashed through his mind. What price had they paid for this victory? With leaden feet, Chris led his team through the ship's ravaged corridors, dreading what they might find. The once pristine halls were now a grotesque tableau of destruction, the walls scorched and pitted by the pulse's fury. But it was the silence that unnerved him the most, the absence of the drone's inhuman shrieks, the eerie stillness that had settled over the ship like a shroud. As they approached the reactor room, Chris's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to turn back, to flee from the grim reality that awaited him. But he owed it to Princess Primus to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The door to the reactor room hung off its hinges, a gaping maw of twisted metal. Chris stepped through, his breath catching in his throat as his gaze fell upon the scene of carnage within. The room was a ruin of shattered equipment and scorched metal, the once mighty reactor core now a blackened husk, and there amidst the wreckage lay the broken body of Princess Primus. Chris rushed to her side, his medical training forgotten as he gathered her into his arms. Her armor was rent and torn, her once vibrant sapphire skin now ashen and dull. But even in death, there was a serenity to her features, a quiet dignity that spoke of her unwavering courage. "So I'm sorry," Chris choked out, his tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry." But as he cradled her lifeless form, something caught his eye, a glint of light amidst the darkness. With trembling fingers, he reached out and plucked a small, crystalline device from Princess Primus's hand. "What is it?" one of his team members asked, their voice hushed with reverence. Chris turned the device over in his palm, his eyes widening as he realized what he held. "It's a data drive," he breathed. "She must have downloaded the ship's records before—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. But as he looked down at the drive, a flicker of hope stirred in his chest. Even in her final moments, Princess Primus had been fighting for their future, securing the knowledge they needed to ensure that this nightmare would never be repeated. "With this," Chris said softly, his voice trembling with emotion, "we can make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. We can learn from this, be better prepared if we ever face a threat like this again." He closed his fingers around the drive, holding it close to his heart. It was a small thing, a fragile spark of light amidst the darkness. But it was also a testament to Princess Primus's legacy, to the unbreakable spirit that had driven her to give her life for the sake of others. As Chris and his team made their way back to the bridge, the weight of what they had endured settled heavy on their shoulders. They had won the battle, but the scars it had left, both physical and emotional, would linger long after they returned to Earth. But amidst the pain and the grief, there was also a flicker of something else, a grim determination, a resolve to honor the sacrifices that had been made. Princess Primus had given her life so that they might live, and Chris knew that he would spend the rest of his days striving to be worthy of that gift. The scene shifts back to the lecture hall, the students hanging on Chris's every word. "And that," he says softly, "is the true story of how one Orion princess changed the course of history, how her bravery and selflessness saved not just her own people, but all of us." He looks down at the crystalline drive in his hand, his eyes distant with memory. We owe her a debt that can never be repaid, but we can honor her legacy by remembering her sacrifice, by striving to be the best version of ourselves in the face of adversity. Chris's voice takes on a somber tone as he recounts the aftermath of the mission. "We brought Princess Primus's body back to the Orion homeworld, a procession of honor and grief. The streets were lined with thousands of Orions, their heads bowed in respect as her casket passed. The air was heavy with the weight of their sorrow, a tangible thing that seemed to press down on us all." He pauses, his eyes distant with memory. The Emperor himself presided over her funeral, a towering figure of strength and grace. But as he stood before her casket, his stoic facade cracked, and for a moment we saw the depth of his grief. Tears streamed down his face as he placed a clawed hand on the smooth metal surface, a final goodbye to the daughter he had lost. Chris's voice grows stronger as he continues. But even in his mourning, the Emperor recognized the significance of what Princess Primus had accomplished. Her sacrifice had not only saved the Orion people, but had also forged a bond between our two species that would change the course of history. The scene shifts, and the students find themselves in a grand hall, its walls adorned with intricate tapestries depicting the history of the Orion people. Chris stands before the Orion High Council, a group of elders clad in flowing robes of deep blue and silver. In his hand, he holds the data drive, the key to their future. "I presented the information Princess Primus had gathered to the council," Chris says, his voice echoing through the hall. "I told them of her bravery, of the sacrifices she had made to secure this knowledge, and then I shared my own findings, the breakthroughs we had made in understanding the parasite's biology and behavior." He looks out over the sea of faces, each one rapt with attention. "Together we devised a plan to eradicate the threat once and for all. The Orions would share their advanced technology with Earth, their ships and weapons and scientific knowledge. In return, we would provide our medical expertise and resources, our understanding of disease and our tireless dedication to finding a cure." Chris's voice grows thick with emotion as he remembers those early days of the Alliance. It was an unprecedented partnership, born from the ashes of tragedy and the unwavering determination of two species to survive. We worked side by side, human and Orion, united in our common goal. The scene shifts again, and the students are transported to the front lines of the war against the parasite. They see Chris and his team, clad in sleek, Orion-designed protective gear, boarding infected ships and stations, their weapons at the ready. They watch as the team works tirelessly to contain the spread of the parasite, to quarantine affected planets and develop new treatments for the infected. "It was a long and arduous process," Chris says, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. "We lost good people, brave men and women who gave their lives to protect others. But we never wavered in our resolve. We knew that we were fighting not just for ourselves but for the future of our species and the galaxy as a whole." He looks out over the sea of faces, his eyes blazing with the fire of determination. "And in the end we emerged victorious. The parasite was eradicated, its threat wiped from the stars, and in its place, a new alliance was born, a bond between human and Orion that would shape the destiny of the galaxy for generations to come." Chris's voice grows soft, almost reverent as he speaks of the legacy of their victory. Princess Primus's sacrifice was not in vain. Her bravery, her selflessness, had given us the key to our survival. And in the years that followed, her memory would be honored by both our peoples, a shining example of the heights to which we could rise when we stood together. As the young Orion student turns to leave, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief, Chris calls out to her, "Wait!" The student pauses, her hand on the door, and looks back at the grizzled doctor. Chris takes a deep breath, his eyes haunted by the ghosts of his past. "I know it's hard to hear, that the very people we trusted to lead us could betray us so deeply. But you have to understand the stakes were high, and the temptation to seize power was too great for some." He walks over to the window, gazing out at the stars that once held such promise. "I spent years trying to uncover the truth, chasing down every lead, every whisper of a rumor, but the more I dug, the more I realized how deep the corruption went." Chris turns back to the student, his voice low and intense. "There were those on the Orion side who saw the Alliance as a threat to their way of life, their ancient traditions of conquest and domination, and on the human side there were those who feared the Orion's advanced technology, who worried that we were giving away too much in exchange for their help." He shakes his head, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And so they conspired in secret meetings and shadowy backroom deals to sabotage the very thing that could have saved us all. They stole the data drive, the key to our future, and used it as a weapon to drive us apart." The student's eyes widen, her voice trembling as she speaks. "But surely there must have been those who opposed them, who fought back against their treachery." Chris nods, his expression grim. "There were, and I was one of them, but we were outmatched and outmaneuvered at every turn. They had the resources, the influence, the power to silence anyone who got too close to the truth." He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small battered notebook. "This is all I have left of those days, the scraps of evidence I managed to gather before they shut me down. Names, dates, locations, puzzle pieces that never quite fit together." Chris places a hand on her shoulder, his eyes fierce with determination. "Because you're the future, the hope for a better tomorrow. You and your generation, you have the power to finish what we started, to pick up the pieces and build something new." He takes a step back, his voice ringing out in the empty lecture hall. "Princess Primus died for the dream of a united galaxy, a future where our two species could live and work together in harmony. It's up to us to make that dream a reality, no matter the cost." As she turns to leave, Chris calls out one last time, "Remember, the road ahead won't be easy. There will be those who oppose you, who seek to maintain the status quo at any cost, but you must never give up, never lose sight of the goal." The student pauses at the door, her eyes blazing with the same fierce determination that once drove a young doctor to risk everything for the sake of a distant star. "I won't, Dr. Kennedy. I promise." And with that she is gone, leaving Chris alone in the empty lecture hall, the weight of the past bearing down on him like a physical force. He slumps into a chair, his head in his hands, as the memories of all he has lost wash over him in a tidal wave of grief and regret. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.